The discharge summary for Eleanor Marsh was filed on a Tuesday. Cause of discharge, transfer to family care. Authorized by Dr. Patricia Vance, attending physician. Witnessed by 2 nursing staff, 1 administrative coordinator. Eleanor Marsh had no family. Her emergency contact field had read, none listed, for 11 years. Her room was cleaned and reassigned within 48 hours. I found her meal preference card in the recycling bin outside the dietary office. It still had her name on it. I should explain how this started. My name is Daniel Croft. I spent 4 years as a quality assurance and compliance coordinator at Sycamore Ridge Extended Care, a 214-bed long-term care and memory support facility in a mid-sized city in the upper Midwest. The role sounds administrative because it mostly was. I reviewed care plans, audited medication records, tracked incident documentation, ensured that our operational practices aligned with both state licensing requirements and internal policy. I attended quarterly board reviews, submitted utilization reports to our parent management group, and spent a significant portion of each week in a small interior office that smelled faintly of toner and old carpet reviewing documentation that most people in the building considered secondary to the actual work of caring for residents. I was good at the job. Not particularly passionate about it, but careful, which in compliance work amounts to the same thing. I noticed discrepancies. I followed them. I filed what needed to be filed and flagged what needed to be flagged. In 4 years, I had generated 23 formal internal audit findings, of which 19 were resolved through process corrections and 4 were escalated to our regional management group for further review. My performance evaluations described me as detail-oriented, methodical, and thorough. I want that established before I explain the rest, because what I'm about to describe will sound like the account of someone who was either paranoid, incompetent, or both. I was neither. I know what I saw. I know what the record said. I know what those 2 things failing to match each other means, and I have spent the better part of 14 months since leaving Sycamore Ridge trying to locate a framework in which both can simultaneously be true. I haven't found one. The facility itself is worth describing because the building matters in ways that took me a long time to understand. Sycamore Ridge was built in 1987 as a standalone skilled nursing facility and expanded in 2004 when the East Wing was added, a 2-floor addition that roughly doubled capacity and introduced the memory care unit on the 2nd floor. The original structure and the addition were connected by a central corridor that the staff called the bridge, though it wasn't architecturally a bridge. It was just a hallway roughly 40 feet long with slightly lower ceilings than either wing and a slightly different floor tile that no one had ever updated to match. There were 4 common areas, a dining room, a therapy suite, a small chapel that was nominally non-denominational but had been donated by a Lutheran family and still had a cross mounted above the doorway, and a covered outdoor courtyard that was accessible from the ground floor of each wing. The building held 214 beds distributed across 5 residential units, 3 general long-term care units numbered 1, 2, and 3, a post-acute short-stay unit referred to internally as PASS, and the memory care unit on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, which the staff and family literature called the Reflections neighborhood and which everyone who worked there called simply the 2nd floor. Each unit had a nursing station, a medication room, a clean utility room, and a soiled utility room, as well as individual resident rooms that were either private or semi-private depending on funding source and availability. The administrative offices, my office included, were in the original West Wing on the ground floor, which meant I was physically closer to Units 1 and 2 and the main entrance than I was to the memory care unit. The 2nd floor was, in practical terms, a separate world from the rest of the building. Access required either the elevator or a stairwell, both located at the far end of the East Wing. The staff up there worked a largely self-contained shift. The residents didn't come down except for scheduled activities or medical appointments. Visitors had to sign in at the main desk and then sign in again at the second-floor entry, which used a keypad rather than a staff-operated door, as a safety measure to prevent residents with dementia from wandering out unescorted. I mention all of this because the physical separation of the second floor was not incidental. It becomes important. I want to be precise about when things started, because the temptation in retrospect is to identify the beginning as the moment I became aware of the problem. But awareness is not the same as beginning. The problem, as far as I've been able to reconstruct it, had been in motion for substantially longer than I knew. The moment I became aware of it was a Wednesday morning in late March, 17 months before I resigned. I was reviewing the prior month's discharge and transfer documentation as part of a routine monthly audit, standard process, something I did at the beginning of every month. Discharges and transfers generate a significant volume of paperwork in a long-term care facility: physician orders, discharge summaries, medication reconciliation, family notification documentation, care plan closure notes, bed availability updates, billing closure records. The state licensing body requires that discharge documentation be completed within specified time frames, and part of my audit function was verifying that those time frames were being met. I was not looking for anything unusual. I was checking completion rates, reviewing signatures, confirming that the required elements were present in each file. I had a printed summary from our EHR system. We used a platform called Point-Click Care, which is standard across most of the industry, and I was cross-referencing it against the physical chart files that were maintained in the medical records room adjacent to my office. Eleanor Marsh's file was the 11th I reviewed that morning. The discharge summary was complete. The signatures were present. The documented reason for discharge was transfer to family care, which is a standard discharge category, common enough that it doesn't typically trigger additional review. The physician's signature was Dr. Vance's, which was appropriate. She was Eleanor's attending. The nursing documentation was signed by the floor charge nurse for Unit 2, a woman named Sandra Preller who had been with the facility for over a decade and whose documentation I had never had cause to question. I almost moved on. I would have moved on if the folder hadn't been slightly thicker than it should have been for a discharge of that type. The extra thickness was a second set of contact and intake documents clipped to the back of the folder. Standard admission paperwork that had been filed when Eleanor was first admitted to Sycamore Ridge 11 years prior. I don't know why I looked at it. Habit, probably. I was thorough by training. The emergency contact field on the original admission form was blank. Not redacted. Not filled in with none. Literally blank, with a handwritten notation in the margin that read per resident, no living family, no designated representative. I checked the discharge authorization. Transfer to family care requires documented family contact, a name, a relationship, a phone number, and either a signed acknowledgement from the receiving party or a documented verbal confirmation with date and time. The discharge summary for Eleanor Marsh had a name, M. Marsh, nephew, a phone number with a 414 area code, and a notation that verbal confirmation had been received by the social worker on record, a woman named Therese Alcott. Therese Alcott had left the facility 8 months prior. I sat with that for a moment. Then I looked up Eleanor Marsh's current room assignment in the system. Her room, 214, a private room in Unit 2, was listed as available and clean. I walked to Unit 2. The door to room 214 was open. The bed was made with fresh linens. There was a generic landscape print on the wall that I recognized as one of the facility stock pictures, the ones that came out of storage when rooms were cleaned out between occupants. Eleanor Marsh's furniture, a small maple dresser, a recliner with a floral slipcover that I remembered seeing through the doorway on previous rounds, was gone. I went to the nursing station and asked Sandra Preller when Eleanor had been discharged. Sandra said, "About 2 weeks ago, I think. The nephew came and got her." I asked if she had met the nephew. She thought about it. Then she said she thought so. She said he came in on a weekday, that he was a quiet man, that he had handled everything with Therese before Therese left and the paperwork had just taken a while to finalize. I asked if she could describe him. She said she didn't really remember his face. Said it had been a busy week. I thanked her and went back to my office. The phone number on the discharge summary was disconnected. I tried it twice, on 2 separate days. The second time I got a recording telling me the number was not in service. The area code was Milwaukee, which meant nothing by itself. People moved, numbers changed, but the combination of the disconnected number and the blank emergency contact field and Therese Alcott's departure 8 months before the discharge was documented sat in my mind in the way that small procedural inconsistencies always did. Not alarm. Just the low hum of something that didn't line up. I flagged it in my internal notes. I opened an informal tracking entry in my own audit log, which was a personal spreadsheet I maintained in addition to the formal reporting system, something I'd been doing since my second year, because I found it easier to track patterns across multiple months in my own format than in the EHR's built-in reporting tools. I noted the discrepancy, the disconnected contact number, and the absence of a family record in the original admission file. Then I continued with the rest of my March audit and mostly set it aside for the next 6 weeks. The second one was a man named Howard Fink, 81 years old, former electrician, had been on Unit 1 for 4 years following a series of small strokes that had significantly reduced his independence. His discharge was filed in the same month as Eleanor's, though I hadn't caught it in my initial review because it had been filed under a slightly different category, discharge to assisted living, rather than family care. I found it in late April, when I was doing a quarterly cross-check of bed utilization data against the discharge log. Howard Fink's name appeared in the discharge log with a notation that he had transferred to a memory care facility in the suburbs, name and address documented, signed off by the Unit 1 charge nurse and by Dr. Marcus Webb, one of our 2 attending physicians. I called the receiving facility. Standard procedure when doing a utilization audit, we were supposed to confirm transfer documentation with receiving providers at least quarterly. The woman who answered told me they had no record of a Howard Fink. I gave her the date of transfer, his date of birth, his previous diagnosis. She put me on hold. When she came back she said the name didn't appear in their admissions for that month or for the 3 months on either side. I said, could there be a record under a different name, possibly a transcription error? She said she'd check. She did. She said no. I thanked her and hung up. I pulled Howard Fink's chart. The transfer documentation was complete. Physician order. Nursing summary. Medication list. A copy of the receiving facility's intake form, which had a fax header showing their facility name and a date 7 weeks prior. I called them back and asked about the fax. The woman I reached this time was a supervisor. I read her the fax header information. She said they did have a fax number matching the one on the header, but that their fax logs from that period didn't show an incoming transmission on that date. I said I was looking at a document with their header on it. She said she understood that. She said their logs showed no record of it. I drove past the facility that evening after work. I told myself it was on my way home, which was approximately true. The building was real. The sign matched the name on the transfer paperwork. The parking lot had a garden and a flagpole and a small fountain that wasn't running yet because it was still early spring and the nights were still cold. I didn't go in. I just drove past. I went home and updated my tracking spreadsheet. 2 files. 2 anomalies. Both involving residents who had no surviving family documented in their original intake records. Both involving discharge documentation that was internally complete but could not be externally verified. Both involving authorization signatures from staff members who were either no longer with the facility or who I knew to have high workloads and limited capacity to scrutinize paperwork closely. I stared at that for a while. Then I went to make dinner. What I need to explain, for this to make sense, is how discharge documentation is supposed to work at a facility like Sycamore Ridge, because the institutional process is what the problem was hiding inside. When a resident is discharged, whether to family, to another facility, to assisted living, or through death, the process generates a significant paper trail that passes through multiple hands. The attending physician authorizes the discharge and signs the discharge order. The nursing staff complete a discharge summary covering the resident's current health status, medication list, and any care needs the receiving party should be aware of. The social work department handles family notification and coordinates with the receiving party if there is one. The business office closes out billing and coordinates with the resident's funding source. The medical records department receives the completed chart and files it. In theory, this means that a fraudulent or erroneous discharge would require either the cooperation of multiple staff members across multiple departments, or a series of documentation failures so consistent and so uniform that it effectively produced the same result. In practice, I had spent 4 years watching how this process actually worked. The physician often signed discharge orders in batches, reviewing documentation quickly because there were many other demands on their time. The social work department had been operating understaffed since Therese Alcott left and her replacement was not hired until late June, a gap of nearly 8 months during which social work functions were distributed informally across nursing and administrative staff. The business office processed billing closures from the EHR, which meant they were working from the same data I was reviewing rather than from independent verification. And medical records received completed chart packages and filed them without reviewing their content. That function was mine. Which meant that the only person whose job it was to look at the complete picture across all those separate pieces was me. And I had missed it the first time through. In May I started reviewing discharges differently. I didn't change my formal audit process. I had no authorization to do that unilaterally, and there was no legitimate audit finding I could generate yet because I had 2 anomalies that could both be explained by ordinary error. A disconnected phone number. A receiving facility that couldn't find a record. These things happened. Fax logs had gaps. Families gave secondary contact numbers. I knew this. I wasn't ready to write a formal finding. But I started cross-checking every discharge against 2 data points I hadn't previously included in my routine audit: the original admission file's emergency contact and family information, and at least one external confirmation, a phone call, a callback, something that touched the real world outside the documentation. This added time to my monthly audit. I absorbed it by coming in earlier. By the end of May I had reviewed all discharges from the prior 6 months. 41 total, which was in the normal range for a facility our size. Of those 41, 38 were straightforward: transfers to hospitals with verifiable admission records, deaths with complete death certification, discharges to family care where I reached a real person at the phone number listed, discharges to facilities that could confirm receipt. 3 could not be externally confirmed. Eleanor Marsh, Howard Fink, and a woman named Dorothy Sabo, 77 years old, discharged 4 months prior to a daughter listed as K. Sabo at a phone number that rang endlessly without going to voicemail. Dorothy had been on the 2nd floor. Memory care. She had been admitted 3 years prior following an Alzheimer's diagnosis and had, according to all nursing documentation, been progressing steadily through mid-stage disease. The discharge notation for Dorothy said, "Discharge to family care, daughter taking resident home, resident expressed willingness to go." I read that line 4 times. Dorothy Sabo had moderate to advanced Alzheimer's disease. She was not, by clinical documentation dating back 18 months, capable of reliably expressing preference, recognizing family members, or understanding the concept of going home. That wasn't a judgment. It was what the nursing notes said, consistently, across multiple assessments. I pulled her most recent quarterly review. The nursing assessment from 6 weeks before her discharge described her as oriented to person only, intermittently, and noted that she required full assistance with all activities of daily living. The discharge summary described her as alert and oriented, cooperative with the discharge process, able to identify her daughter by name. Those 2 documents described different people. I requested a meeting with our director of nursing, a woman named Carol Haas who had been in the role for 3 years and who I generally found competent and direct. I didn't tell her what the meeting was about. I said I had some questions about discharge documentation processes and wanted to talk through a few chart reviews. She had time on a Thursday afternoon. I brought the 3 files. I laid out what I had found, the external verification failures, the inconsistency in Dorothy Sabo's cognitive assessment documentation, the pattern of incomplete or unverifiable family contact records. Carol looked at the files carefully. She asked me a few questions about my external verification process. She asked whether I had reached out to Dr. Vance and Dr. Webb about the authorization signatures. I said not yet, that I wanted to bring it to her first. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that discharge documentation quality had been a known weakness during the period when social work was understaffed, that this was something the regional management group had already flagged, and that the facility was in the process of implementing a more structured discharge checklist that would require external verification as a completion criterion. I said that was useful context, but that I was concerned about the specific residents and whether they had actually been safely transferred. Carol said that the records indicated they had. I said the records couldn't be externally verified. She said, "Daniel, if something had gone wrong, a resident had been released to an unsafe situation, or a transfer had failed, we would have heard. The family would have called. The hospital would have called. The state would have gotten involved. The absence of any follow-up complaint is itself a form of confirmation." I said, "Or the residents don't have families, and so no one called." She looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand at the time. Not dismissive. Not defensive. Something more like careful. Like she was choosing what to say. She said, "I'll ask Dr. Vance to do a review of the authorization process. And I'll flag these 3 files for the compliance committee at the next meeting." I said that would be helpful. I went back to my office. The compliance committee met quarterly. The next meeting was 6 weeks out. Between that conversation and the compliance committee meeting, I found 2 more. A man named George Terrence Albright, 83, long-term Unit 3, no family of record, discharged to son, T. Albright, to a home address in a town 40 minutes north of the city. I drove there on a Saturday morning. I told my wife I was running errands. The address was real. It was a residential street. The house number corresponded to a well-maintained colonial with a 2-car garage and a garden that was just starting to come up along the front walk. I didn't knock. I drove past twice. There were lights on inside. There was a car in the driveway. I had no idea whether George Albright was in that house. I had no way of knowing. I couldn't knock on the door. I had no official standing to do so outside the facility. I wasn't a social worker, wasn't a licensing inspector, wasn't law enforcement. I was a compliance coordinator who had driven 40 minutes on a Saturday to look at a house, and I was sitting in my car on a public street feeling the specific unease of having followed something to a point where I had no procedural tools left. I wrote the address in my notebook. I drove home. The fifth was a woman named Ruth Ann Pelletier, 89, the oldest of the 5, who had been on the second floor for 6 years. Her discharge was the most recent, filed 11 days before the Compliance Committee meeting. Transferred to a care home in the same city. The receiving facility, I called them, told me they had no record of her. I asked if they could check by date of birth. They could. They checked. No record. I asked if they could check by the transferring facility's name and date. Long pause. The woman on the phone said, "We don't have a transfer from Sycamore Ridge on that date." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat very still for a moment and thought about the fact that there were now 5 residents I could not locate and that the documentation for all 5 was internally coherent and externally unverifiable, and that the pattern connecting them, the absence of family, the institutional completeness of the paperwork, the signatures of people who were either gone or busy, was not the kind of pattern that assembles itself accidentally. The Compliance Committee meeting was on a Tuesday. Carol Haas attended. Dr. Vance attended. The administrator, a man named Robert Kettner who managed the facility's relationship with the regional management group and who had been in the role for 8 years, attended. The director of social services, who was new and still learning the building, attended. The business office manager attended. I presented my findings. 5 cases. External verification failures across all 5. Cognitive documentation inconsistency in at least 2. A common demographic profile: all 5 residents had no close family of record, no designated representative, no one positioned to follow up on their whereabouts post-discharge. The room was quiet for a moment when I finished. Dr. Vance said that she reviewed and signed a high volume of discharge orders and that she relied on the social work and nursing assessment to confirm the accuracy of the family contact information before signing. She said if the underlying information was inaccurate, that was a documentation quality issue, not a clinical authorization issue. The administrator, Kettner, said he was concerned about the pattern I'd identified and asked whether I had involved the state licensing hotline. I said I hadn't yet, that I had brought it internally first. He said he thought that was appropriate, and that he would like to have the regional compliance officer involved before any external reporting, given the sensitivity. He said this not in a way that felt obstructive. He was measured and professional, but in a way that indicated he understood the implication. An unresolved pattern of 5 residents whose post-discharge location could not be verified was not an internal process quality issue. It was potentially something that state adult protective services would be interested in. Carol Haas said she had initiated a review of all discharges from the past 18 months, not just the 5 I had identified, to determine whether the pattern extended further back. I asked what the timeline for that review was. She said she would have preliminary results within 3 weeks. She did not have preliminary results within 3 weeks. At the 4-week mark, I sent her an email asking for an update. She responded that the review was ongoing and that she would let me know as soon as there was something to report. At 6 weeks, I sent a second email. She asked if we could talk by phone rather than in writing. We did. She said the review was revealing some additional documentation quality issues across a broader time frame, that she was working with Dr. Vance and the regional compliance officer to understand the scope, and that it would be premature to characterize the findings before that process was complete. I said, "Carol, are there more than 5?" She said, "We're still working through the records." I said, "I need you to tell me if there are more than 5. There was a silence on the line. She said, "I'll have something formal for you within the next 2 weeks. I want to make sure we have the full picture before we put anything in writing. I want to be precise about what happened between that phone call and the moment I understood the full scope of what I was inside." I did not wait 2 weeks. I had access to the EHR. My role gave me read access to all resident records, active and discharged. I had never used that access to conduct a review outside my defined audit scope without prior authorization, because that was the kind of overreach that got compliance coordinators written up and occasionally terminated. I was aware that what I was about to do was outside my operational lane. I did it anyway. I built a query in the EHR's reporting module that filtered all discharges from the past 3 years by 3 criteria: discharge category not equal to death, emergency contact field empty or listed as none on the most recent intake form, and discharge authorization signed by the attending physician without a corresponding social work contact note. The query ran for about 40 seconds. It returned 61 records. I sat there and looked at 61 names. Some of them would have legitimate explanations. The database wasn't perfect. Intake forms got updated and the updates didn't always carry through correctly. Social work contact notes sometimes got filed under a different category. I knew this. I had been doing this job for 4 years and I knew exactly how documentation gaps occurred innocently. I started going through the list. By the time I had reviewed 23 files in detail, it was 7:30 in the evening. The building had shifted to overnight staffing. The administrative wing was empty except for me. The fluorescent lights in my office felt too bright. I had found 11 files that looked like Eleanor Marsh. 11 residents, in addition to the 5 I already had, with no verifiable external destination, no confirmed family contact, no receiving party I could reach. 16 total. 16 residents. Across 3 years. From a single building. I went to the second floor. I want to explain why I went to the second floor, because it wasn't entirely rational. Most of the 16 had been on the general long-term care units, units 1, 2, and 3. Only 4 were from memory care. But the second floor had always felt, to me, like the part of the building that operated most independently, most invisibly to the rest of the facility, and the fact that the access keypad logged every entry and exit meant there was a data record up there that I hadn't cross-referenced against anything yet. I badged through the main entrance, took the elevator to the second floor, and entered my access code at the memory care keypad. The door unlocked. I went in. The second floor at 7:30 on a weeknight was quiet in the particular way that memory care units are quiet, not silent, but occupied by a kind of ambient sound that has nothing to do with distress or agitation. A television somewhere. The soft movement of the overnight aide making rounds. The particular low hum of the HVAC system that was always slightly different up here than in the rest of the building. The charge nurse at the nursing station was a woman named Yvonne Tran, who had been on nights for 2 years. She looked up when I came in and seemed mildly surprised to see me. I said I was doing a documentation review and asked if I could use the workstation at the end of the station to check some records. She said of course. I sat down and pulled up the keypad access log for the second floor, which was a separate system from the main building access log. It fed into a security platform rather than the EHR, and I had read access to it through my compliance credentials, though I rarely used it. I entered a date range covering the past 3 years. The log showed every entry and exit. Staff badge numbers, timestamps, duration of visit. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was looking for the discharges. On the dates of each second-floor discharge for the 4 residents I'd identified from memory care, I cross-referenced the access log to see who had been on the floor. Standard entries, all 4 days. Nursing staff. Physicians. Therapy staff on the days they worked up there. For one of the discharges, a woman named Margaret Cope, 84, discharged 14 months prior. There was an entry at 2:17 p.m. by a badge registered to Thomas Kettner. Thomas Kettner. Not Robert Kettner, the administrator. I checked the staff directory. Thomas Kettner was not in it. I checked the Access Systems credential database. Badge number registered to Thomas Kettner, issued 3 years and 4 months ago. No role listed. No department. An email address consisting of a string of letters that didn't correspond to anyone in our directory. The badge had been used on 6 separate occasions over the past 3 years. Always during daytime hours. Always during or immediately before a discharge. 6 of the 16. I printed the access log entries. I put them in a folder. I drove home, sat at my kitchen table, and wrote a complete summary of everything I had found. Names, dates, discharge categories, external verification failures, the EHR query results, the access log entries for Thomas Kettner's badge. Then I drafted an email to the State Licensing and Certification Division's complaint intake line. I didn't send it that night. I had been in compliance long enough to know that an email sent at 11 p.m. after an unauthorized database query, while my own facility's internal review was supposedly in progress, was not the instrument I wanted to use. Timing and form mattered in regulatory reporting. I wanted to be deliberate. I went to bed. I didn't sleep particularly well. In the morning I reread what I had written. I added 3 additional details I'd remembered overnight. I reread it again. Then I got a meeting request from Robert Kettner. The meeting request was sent at 7:43 a.m. The subject line was, Documentation Review, Follow-up. The invitees were me, Kettner, Carol Haas, and the Regional Compliance Officer, a woman named Janet Freed who I had met twice before at quarterly review calls. She was dialing in remotely. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock that morning. I went. Kettner opened by saying that the internal review had produced some significant findings and that he wanted to be transparent with me about what they had discovered before any further escalation occurred. He said he wanted this to be a collaborative process and that he understood my concerns were genuine and well documented. Carol Haas slid a folder across the table. Inside the folder was a report. The cover page identified it as a summary of discharge documentation review, prepared by the facility's regional management group with input from the director of nursing. It was dated 2 days prior. I read the executive summary. It acknowledged documentation quality failures across a subset of discharges over a 3-year period. It attributed those failures to staffing gaps in social work and inconsistent application of the discharge verification checklist. It outlined a corrective action plan involving enhanced documentation protocols, additional social work staffing, and mandatory discharge verification training for nursing and administrative staff. It identified 5 residents by name whose discharge documentation was characterized as incomplete. 5. Eleanor Marsh, Howard Fink, Dorothy Sabo, George Albright, Ruth and Pelletier. The original 5. The 11 I had found in my own query were not in the report. Thomas Kettner's badge was not in the report. I looked up from the document. Janet Freed, on the phone, said that the corrective action plan represented a good faith response to the findings and that she would be following up monthly to track implementation. She said the